Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, InaneDragon, and tonight we're giving Christian Sophistry another look-see. Our friend here is going to explain to us our burden of rejoinder as he sees it. Presumably because all disagreements, all arguments, whether formal debate or Twitter spat, obey the rules of Debate Club. Which is a lot like Fight Club, except that the first rule is that you do indeed talk about Debate Club.
Okay, so you've probably heard seasoned critics talk about the burden of proof. If not, let me explain. The burden of proof is the responsibility of anybody who makes a claim to support that claim with reasonable proof.
So far, I agree. Nothing much to say about this, although I should note that we'll likely argue sooner or later what constitutes reasonable proof. And just for maximal clarity, we should speak in terms of reasonable evidence. After all, we are trying to talk about formal definitions, and formally, proof is only available in logic and mathematics.
Now, in competitive debate, if you don't fulfill the burden of proof, you lose. In reality, the burden of proof is a lot less strict because there are a lot of things that are true but can't be proven.
Well, it's not so much that a lot of things can't be proven. After all, this is true whether or not you're talking about competitive debate. It's that when you aren't in competitive debate, you aren't in competitive debate. An argument is not a competitive debate. You trying to convince me to believe in your God through apologetics is not a competitive debate. Me trying to explain a scientific theory to you is not a competitive debate. At least one of these things has its own formal rules that should be followed if we are going to be honest and accurate. And that's the example of me explaining a scientific theory. Same if I'm making any other scientific claim. Now, what is a scientific claim? It's a claim about the nature of observable reality, that's all. And the reason that we impose the burden of proof on religious apologists is because very few of them claim that their God has nothing to do with the nature of observable reality, which makes your God a scientific claim. In the practice of science, there is a burden of proof before accepting any claim. That is why you have the burden of proof, and it's independent from the rules of debate. You're in the house of science when you're talking about objective, observable reality.
But that's not what this video is about. This video is about the much less known counterpart of the burden of proof called the burden of rejoinder. A lot of times critics will bring up the burden of proof in order to have the privilege of being able to sit back and not have any stake in the discussion. Strategically, this is a brilliant move, and if it's used against anybody that isn't familiar with argumentative theory, then it can be really effective.
There are many problems with this. First, we aren't having a competitive debate, so the rules of debate are not invoked. As mentioned above, your burden of proof derives from the fact that you are making a claim about observable reality, and as such, reasonable people can expect you to adhere to the standards of scientific inquiry and discussion, which has no burden of rejoinder, only a burden of proof. Second, in argumentation theory, a rejoinder is a reason not to accept your claim. You haven't demonstrated your claim is such a reason. Therefore, right out of the gate, a rejoinder is already present. Third, when you make an apologetics-based argument, how many people just say, not good enough? How many point out flaws with your argument? The people in the latter case are engaged in offering a rejoinder. They don't have to defend and prop up any other position. Rejoinder is the process of tearing down the foundations, the arguments, even the evidence that you have offered in an attempt to meet your burden of proof. Fourth, the burden of rejoinder, even in a competitive debate, is not invoked unless and until you have fulfilled the burden of proof. If you don't offer reasonable evidence supporting your claim, no one has to do more than laugh in your face. Fifth, the entire idea that you have a burden of rejoinder in most contexts outside of formal debate or scientific discussion is a topic of debate within the field of argumentation theory. I've provided a link to one such voice in that debate below. In short, since we are in a scientific discussion about the nature of observable reality, we play by the rules of scientific discussion, unless you want to argue that your God is neither real nor has any observable effects. Mind you, the latter is a flat-out denial of prayer in Jesus. If you want to make purely philosophical arguments for a God, fine. But I really don't care that much, because the best of those ever accomplish is established deism, and I've talked about why that's worthless already. This next bit is long, so I'm speeding you up, Josh. I don't want people to miss the context.
But it's not exactly true. At least not in the way that it's being used, and that's not me accusing critics of intentionally lying to Christians in order to gain an upper hand. It's just a less informed tactic that is used quite often from critics. Anyone who engages in a rational discussion with somebody of an opposing view, which is an argument, takes on the burden of rejoinder. The burden of rejoinder is the responsibility of the disagreeer to articulate why they disagree and according to what counterclaims. So the critic has just as much work to do as the person that's making the claim. The burden of rejoinder is not satisfied by simply saying, that's just not good enough. Even if the person making the claim or the affirming party did a completely garbage job of fulfilling their burden of proof, the opposition still has a job to do.
You see, Josh, I left this in despite having thoroughly answered the points you bring up already for a simple reason. You're wrong even if we were in a formal debate. I don't need counterclaims, I need to demonstrate that your argument is insufficient, which is to say, I need to show that it's not good enough. Further, I only need to do this if you've actually met the burden of proof, contra to your claim that I have to do so regardless. If you don't believe me, read up on the debate terminology that I've linked below. Of course, you're also making the mistake of conflating argument with debate by invoking the rules of debate. Debate is a formal subset of argument within argumentation theory. You are applying the rules of a square to the rectangle, so to speak. As I've previously said, the role of a burden of rejoinder within argumentation generally is up for debate amongst argumentation theorists. But I don't even care what they'd have to say on the subject, because we're in the field of science when we're talking about observable reality, and you want a God that is both observable and real, and therefore within the house of science. The burden of rejoinder in the sense you've described does not exist therein.
And I think the reason that critics typically aren't aware of this concept is because they typically come from a worldview of scientific naturalism. And in the world of science, it's always one party publishing papers with scientific observations leading to conclusions. That's how they understand the burden of proof. It's just one person talking. But in debate, there's two parties. In argumentation, there's two opposing parties, and the dynamics change to where one person doesn't just get to sit there and let the other person do all the talking.
Well, naturalism has nothing to do with it, but yes, in science, it's your job to prove your claim, independent of any other person attempting to rebuff your claim. In point of fact, it's actually your job to try and disprove your claim, proving it in the process. What's really funny, though, is that you have this one-dimensional view on how science actually works. But it's not just papers and peer review, during which I should add that the reviewers go out of their way to find flaws and alternative explanations, providing the closest thing to a formal burden of rejoinder in science. The proceedings of scientists also include conventions with panels and debates wherein they follow the rules of debate that you're talking about, casual conversations, and midnight bullshit sessions about their pet hypotheses with some friends and some beers. Science is a messy and diverse process that involves many aspects of discussion, argument, and basic guttural humanity. This idea of the placid academic in a lab coat just needs to die, because real science is nothing like you've described. But through it all, the mantra is a resounding put up or shut up. If you can't prove your claim, in the sense of demonstrating that a sufficient pile of evidence supports it, no evidence available to you refutes it, and it's the best explanation for all relevant evidence, then no one will take your claim seriously. Oh, and all of that work, it's on you. Because you don't just get to point to an old book. You don't just get to hide behind rhetorical tricks. In the down and dirty work of science, you have to stand on the evidence or fall in the trash heap. I'm InaneDragon, and hopefully you'll give this a bit of a think, Josh. For the rest of you, I hope that you've enjoyed the video enough to consider subscribing. No matter how you feel on the topic, consider rating the video, or better yet, leave a comment with your thoughts down below. I can't improve if you don't tell me how I screwed up. For those with a desire to separate themselves from hard-earned money and support small creators, Patreon has rescinded their idea of putting fees on you folk, so come on and lend a hand. I'll be looking at diversifying ways that you can support the channel, including a merch store, so as to protect all of us from future bad decisions. Thank you all, and good night.